Welcome. So we are looking at cardiopulmonary, and looking at cardiopulmonary involves that we are supposed to talk about uh, everything that happens in the cardiopulmonary system, which is the heart and the pulmonary system. So to start, we are going to discuss the mechanics of breathing. We have to understand how breathing occurs and what makes breathing possible. Okay, so today's lecture is on the mechanics of breathing. So at the end of this lecture, we should be able to differentiate among the types of pulmonary ventilation, among the types of pulmonary ventilation, which are minute ventilation, alveolar ventilation, and dead space ventilation. Key terms ventilation, amongst the terms that we're going to find are ventilation, and ventilation is just the body process of breathing, taking air in and out is what is referred to as ventilation. And partial pressure, the pressure exerted by a gas either in air or in dissolved form. So pressure, let's understand pressure as just the amount of force that the particle or the gas exerts on the given wall. So pressure being defined as such, it can exist in air or in dissolved substance, like it exists in blood. So it can exist as it is in air, or when we inhale it, it will dissolve in fluid, and it is going to exert some pressure in the fluid. Ventilation is the rate at which gas enters and leaves the lungs, which is typically breathing. Okay, the types of ventilation rates. In respiratory physiology, the ventilation rate is the rate at which gas enters or leaves the lungs. It generally expressed as the volume of air times the respiratory rate. The volume of air can refer to the volume, which is the amount of inhaled air in an average breath, or sometimes more specific, such as the volume of dead space in the airways. The three types of ventilation are, number one, minute ventilation, okay, which is the amount of air entering the lungs per minute. It can be defined as VE is equal to tidal volume by multiplied by a number of breaths per minute. Alveolar ventilation, which is the amount, that's the second one. The second one is alveolar ventilation, which is the amount of air per unit of time that reaches the alveoli and becomes involved in gaseous exchange. It is defined as VA is equal to tidal volume minus dead space multiplied by respiratory rate. The third one is the dead space ventilation, which is the amount of air per unit time. Okay, the unit of time that is not involved in gaseous exchange, such as the air that remains in the conducting zones. When you're breathing in and out, there is that air that the airways, like the nose going down, they don't remain open. Okay, they do not remain. I mean, they don't remain like empty. There is some air which remains in there which does not take part in gaseous exchange. That is what makes up the dead space. It is defined as a VD equal to volume of dead space multiplied by the respiratory rate. Additionally, the minute ventilation, okay, the minute ventilation, just a minute. Sorry for that. Okay, so we are saying this amount of ventilation is the sum of alveolar and dead space ventilation. Minute ventilation is the sum of alveolar and dead space ventilation, provided that the respiratory rate used to drive them is in terms of breaths per minute. Therefore, the three types of ventilation and the three types of ventilation are mathematically linked to one another. In that, if you have an alteration in minute ventilation, of course, alveolar ventilation will also be affected. If let's say there is an increase in minute ventilation, alveolar ventilation will also increase. Okay, it will also increase. There will be a lot of air that will be reaching the alveoli. if the dead space has increased, everywhere there's going to be an adjustment. Alveolar ventilation will reduce because dead space has increased, and minute ventilation also reduce. Alveolar ventilation is the most important type of ventilation for measuring how much oxygen actually gets into the body. In particular, the body will generally attempt to combat increased dead space by raising the frequency of breaths to try and maintain sufficient levels of alveolar ventilation. So in trying to have a lot of air participate in gaseous exchange, the body will raise the number of breaths so that there is that physiological balance is maintained. Partial pressure, as we have already said, is the kind of pressure that the gas is going to have in dissolved form or in atmospheric air. So in dissolved form, carbon dioxide is going to be in higher concentration and exert a lot of pressure, as well as whereby oxygen is going to also in alveolar air, it is going to have a higher pressure. And it is this difference in pressures that allows for gaseous exchange. When gases dissolve in the bloodstream during ventilation, they are generally described as partial pressure. Therefore, partial pressures are more specifically refers to the relative concentration of these gases by the pressure they exert in dissolved state. In respiratory physiology, partial pressure of oxygen written as this and partial pressure of carbon dioxide written with capital A are partial pressures which refer to these respective gases in the alveoli. The other partial pressure written with a small a, partial pressure of oxygen, partial pressure of carbon dioxide, are partial pressures of these respective gases in arterial blood. Differences in partial pressures of gases between the alveolar air and the bloodstream are the reason that gaseous exchange occur by passive diffusion. Remember, diffusion is the movement of particles from a region of higher concentration to lower concentration. So if carbon dioxide is more concentrated in the arteries, in alveolar arteries, it is going to move from higher concentration to lower concentration, and oxygen being higher concentration in the alveoli, it is also going to move in the same direction from higher to lower, and that is what is going to allow for gaseous exchange to occur. Okay. Okay, so this is just telling us about how these movements are supposed to occur, the movement from higher concentration to lower concentration. So that is about partial pressures, how partial pressures make it possible for the movement of air from higher to lower concentration. Inspiration. This second part, talking about now the mechanics of breathing itself, which is the inspiration part. So at the end of this component, you're supposed to at least outline the mechanics of inspiration. What happens in inspiration? Okay, outline the mechanics of inspiration, and inspiration being defined as the indrawing of air, okay, into a living organism, and accessory muscles, those small muscles that help the diaphragm to carry out its main function of respiration, as well as the intrapleural pressures. The intrapleural pressures are pressure inside the pleural cavity, which is negative compared to the outside air, and becomes even more negative during inspiration. Inhalation is the flow of ambient air in and out of the organism, and inspiration refers to inhalation. In humans, the movement of air in and out of the alveoli is what is referred to as, into the alveoli from the atmosphere is what is referred to as inspiration. Pulmonary ventilation involves three different pressures. So for pulmonary ventilation to occur, the three different pressures will have to come into play. Number one, atmospheric pressure, which is pressure of air outside the body. The second one being intra-alveolar pressure, which is pressure inside the alveoli of the lungs. Then there is intrapleural pressure, which is pressure within the pleural cavity, as well as which make up these three pressures. These pressures are responsible for pulmonary ventilation. So let's now look at the process of inspiration. How does it happen? The mechanics of inspiration. Inspiration begins with the contraction of the diaphragm, which results in expansion of the thoracic cavity and the pleural cavity. The pleural cavity normally has a lower pressure compared to ambient air. Okay, the pleural cavity normally has a lower pressure compared to ambient air. Remember, there is what is known as the pleural cavity, the space that is in between the pleural membranes, which is the parietal pleura, being more inclined towards the chest wall, and the visceral pleura towards the lung tissue. In between there is a pleural cavity which is held by the pressure, by a negative pressure. And this is why we're saying that the pleural cavity normally has a lower pressure compared to ambient air, which is outside. Going to as much as negative 3 millimeters of mercury normally, and typically going to negative 6 millimeters of mercury during inspiration. So during inspiration, it becomes more negative so that it holds further to the chest wall as the chest wall is trying to open it up. So when it expands, the pressure inside the lungs will drop. Okay, pressure and volumes are inversely related in that when the pressure increases, volume decreases, and vice versa. Okay, the force of intrapleural pressure is even strong enough to hold the lungs open during inspiration, despite the natural elastic recoil. You know, the natural tendency of the lung tissue is to recoil. But because of the pressure of the intrapleural pressure in the intrapleural cavity, that pressure which we said is negative is strong enough to hold these lungs open, despite the lung wanting to recoil. The alveolar sacs also expand as a result of being filled with air during inspiration, which contributes to the expansion inside the lungs. Eventually, the pressure inside the lung becomes less negative as the volume inside the lung increases. And when pressure and volume stabilize, air movement stops, inspiration ends, and the expiration begins. So what we are talking about are these pressures. Okay, we have atmospheric pressure up there. Then we have intrapleural pressure here. So the intrapleural pressure in some literatures, you find -3, in others they say -4. So these are the pressures that we are talking about. Under normal, this has a tendency to recoil. So this is the pressure that stops this from recoiling, because this, through the visceral pleura, it holds it to the parietal pleura, which is holding on the wall of the chest. So in between, this is pressure holding this and this. So in other words, this is the pressure is holding this and that. And since this is elastic, this pressure is the one which holds it open. So when during inspiration, when the rib cage goes up, it goes up with this pressure, and this pressure actually reduces further. It goes to -6, so that it holds tighter, so that it pulls the lung tissue open as the contraction of the diaphragm occurs. Then we have intrapulmonary pressure, which is about 760 millimeters of mercury, which is equal to atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure is also equal to 760 millimeters of mercury. But coming back to this statement, okay, when pressure and volume stabilize, air movement stops and inspiration ends. So during this expansion, during normal breathing in, the diaphragm is going to contract. Once the diaphragm contracts, air is going to start dashing in. Once the two equate, from outside going inside. So once, as it is pulling down, here it will be negative and positive air will be running inside to make it positive. So once it gets there, it gets to a point where they become equal. Once they become equal, 760 up, out, and 760 inside, then these two are simply referred to as 0 millimeters of mercury. It does not mean 0 millimeters of mercury is equal to no pressure, No, it simply means the pressure outside is now equal to the pressure inside, and inspiration can cease. And this is where the zero is coming from, because this one can be cancelled to that other one because they are going to be the same. So it is 0 millimeters of mercury. So these are the three important pressures that help us to discuss this: atmospheric pressure, intrapleural pressure. Atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury under normal; intrapleural pressure, which is -4; and intrapulmonary pressure, which is also 760 millimeters of mercury, which are both referred to as zero millimeters of mercury. So for this to happen, there is the accessory muscles that help the diaphragm to carry out its primary function as a primary muscle of inspiration. Okay, and these muscles include the external intercostal muscles, the scalene, the sternocleidomastoid, the trapezius, and all those muscles that occur. And then after the breathing in has occurred. So this is why it is said that breathing in is active, because for breathing in to occur, the diaphragm will have to contract. Muscle contraction takes the apies to act on it and spread the stimuli. So once this muscle contracts and the other muscles there contract, then the rib cage, the diaphragm is going to stretch down while the rib cage opens. Once they open, stretching these airways, once they stretch them open, then air will dash in. And that is what is known as inspiration. So once there is no this muscle contraction, active muscle contraction, inspiration will not occur. And that is why it is active. But once it occurs, we have already mentioned that what helps, the lung tissue has the capacity or has the characteristic of recoiling. Once inspiration occurs and the input, the stimulus that caused inspiration goes off, the major muscle, the main muscle of inspiration, which is the diaphragm, recoiling occurs. And when recoiling occurs, it now expels the air from the airways, which is the process known as exhalation. So exhalation is passive. The purpose of exhalation is to remove metabolic waste, primary carbon dioxide, as well as the body, carbon dioxide from the body from gas exchange. So once inspiration occurs, gas exchange also takes place, the one we've discussed earlier on, which is different, which is due to difference in the partial pressures occurs. Once it occurs, then gaseous exchange also takes place, then exhalation. So that is the process that governs this process of inspiration, which is expiration and expiration. Inspiration and expiration. Okay. The process of expiration is typically passive, as we have already established. Okay. And it is divided into two types. Okay. There is what is known as passive, involuntary expiration and voluntary expiration. So under voluntary expiration is actually controlled. Okay, voluntary expiration is actually controlled. It is the amount of air that is breathed in for you to achieve a certain function. Like when you are speaking. When you are speaking, you are going to breathe in a certain amount of air so that you produce the voice projection according to what you want to communicate. If you want to shout, you're breathing as much as you can and project it like that. If you are singing, depending on the pitch, just like that, that is known as voluntary inspiration. Nervous system components that control voluntary expiration is the motor cortex, controlled by the nervous system. Involuntary expression, on the other hand, is the one that happens, that does not happen under conscious control. This one, you don't think about it. Like the normal breathing that we are doing. Nobody's thinking about breathing. It is just happening. The principal neural control center for involuntary expression consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons that are located under in the brainstem, directly beneath the brain. And these are just the muscles that help us into achieving these activities and what they do. Control of respiration and the respiratory centers is actually done by the central nervous system. The respiratory centers contain central chemoreceptors that detect pH, not basically by the central nervous system, but by the systems that are centrally located. Detect pH in the blood and send signals to the respiratory centers of the brain to adjust the voluntary rate to change acidity. Okay, so these are detected centrally, they are detected as well as in the peripheral. So they are what are known as peripheral chemoreceptors and central chemoreceptors. In other blood vessels that perform the function, they also perform the same function as well. So these chemoreceptors will detect the amount of oxygen and the amount of carbon dioxide that is in blood. So when they detect that oxygen levels carbon dioxide levels are getting higher in blood, they are going to send to the motor cortex, they send the signal to say we increase the respiratory rate, and the respiratory rate increases so that it reduces on the oxygen burden. Okay, and breathing is controlled like that. In the medulla oblongata, the medulla oblongata is the primary center of respiration, which controls respiration. Its main function is to send signals to the muscles that control respiration to cause breathing to occur. There are two regions in the medulla that do that function. Number one, there is the ventral respiratory group, which stimulates expiration. Okay. Then there is the dorsal respiratory group, which stimulates inspiration. The medulla also controls the reflexes for non-respiratory air movements, such as coughing. You know, when you are coughing, when you are sneezing, when you are trying to swallow, it all starts with some breathing in. Okay? It all starts with some respiration. So you will have to breathe in before the air actually, before you achieve that activity. The bone also has some centers which is found underneath the medulla, and its main function is to control the rate or speed of involuntary movement. So there is the apneustic center, which sends signals for inspiration for long and deep breaths. Okay, then there is also the pneumotaxic center, which sends signals to inhibit inspiration that allows it to finally control the respiratory rate. So the other one controls the intensity of breathing and is inhibited by stretch receptors and as well as the pneumotaxic center. So once the breathing in is adequate, the pneumotaxic center also comes in and inhibits, so that we have that fine balance. Both the apneustic and the pneumotaxic center work against each other together to control the respiratory rate. So these are just some of the centers that we have discussed, and you can just go through them, and they are trying to enhance what we have discussed. So breathing patterns, there are a number of breathing patterns depending on the situation that is given. Breathing is an autonomic process that moves air in and out of the lungs, and breathing patterns refer to the respiratory rate, which is defined as the frequency of breaths over a period of time, as well as the amount of air cycled during breathing. Breathing patterns are an important diagnostic criteria for many illnesses, including some which involve more than the respiratory system itself. So from the way somebody is breathing, you can be able to tell that this person is not breathing in normally, and it is a very important diagnostic tool or criteria. An average human adult, the average respiratory rate is about 12 breaths per minute, with a tidal volume of about 500 mils, okay? And a minute ventilation of 6 liters per minute. Though these numbers vary from person to person. Infants and children are considerably higher respiratory rates than adults because the children breathe much quicker. You know, the body will try by all means to maintain its 500 mils, it's 0.5 liters of breathing, okay, of tidal volume. So in children, because they have a smaller space for gaseous exchange, little space for gaseous exchange, children are going to have a higher respiratory rate as compared to adults. But as time and age goes by, you find that the respiratory rate actually starts getting back to normal. So you find here, like for neonates, it's between 30 to 60 per minute, infants reducing like that all the way up to older children and adults within 50 to 20 breaths per minute. Okay, so these are the four lung volumes and capacities. So we said the normal the normal amount of air that is breathed in a minute is referred to as tidal volume. It is equal to 500 mils per minute. So this is the normal air that you breathe in a normal breath. But even after you have breathed in, you breathe in at the end of breathing in, when you want to breathe out, you hold and breathe in fully. You can still breathe in some more, in some air more than 500 mils to the tune of 2,500 mils, which is referred to as respiratory reserve volume. So to have to go to the respiratory reserve volume, where it just means you have some more space, the space that can be accommodated into the respiratory space after normal breathing in is just equal to 2,500 mils. Then after breathing in and out, at breathing out, you can actually, after you breathe out, you can actually breathe some more air out to the tune of 1,500 mils, which is expiratory reserve volume, which is this volume that is coming down. Then there is the amount of air that remains in the airspace and in the airspace holding onto the volume of the whole airspace to the tune of 1,500 mils. The capacities are actually the additions of the volume. In the inspiratory capacity, we have 3,000, which is 500 tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. So inspiratory capacity is equal to tidal volume plus inspiratory volume. Okay. Functional reserve capacity is equal to expiratory reserve volume plus residual volume. It also goes to 3,000 mils. Then vital capacity, representing the amount of space that can be used for the process of respiration, which is equal to inspiratory reserve volume, tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume. So this is the amount of, this is the capacity which is available for air to move in and out, which is equal to 4,500. Then total lung capacity is equal to 6 liters. If you see, so if you add all these numbers from there to here, it is giving you the 60 liters. So these are the four volumes and the four lung capacities. So these are just some of the patterns of the breathing patterns. We have the eupnea, which is the term used for normal respiratory rate in an individual at rest. Then commonly we have the dyspnea, which is the shortness of breath. It describes the dramatically decreased tidal volume and sometimes increased respiratory rate, leading to a sensation of breathlessness. Plus these other types of breathing. Okay, so this is what we have for today. Thank you so much for listening.